I feel very privileged to be here talking to you this afternoon. I feel a bit like a lion in a den of Daniels. Thank you for that one. I also, just reflecting on that first Isaac meeting in Florida, it's 20 years, it's the first time I've been invited to speak. That tells you a lot. I'm going to tell... I'm going to try not to bore you with too many slides, but I probably will, because I'm passionate about a number of things. I'm passionate about Jesus. I'm passionate about family. I'm passionate about recovery. And I'm passionate about training and equipping the church to do the work that God's called it to reach the poor and the marginalised and those who are struggling with addictions. And I want to talk this afternoon about the whole issue of families. Because I believe that families are important. I've got 10 grandchildren, 7 of whom are following Jesus.
Amen. And
I go, yes! I'm really, really excited about that. But I meet families where nobody's following Jesus, where there is just misery, where there is a lack of faith, where there is I couldn't possibly believe in Jesus because this has happened and that has happened and they've done this to me and the others have done that to me. And all the negative stuff that goes with that. First thing I want to say is this, is that good theology leads to good care. Our faith needs to set the boundaries in shaping our projects, not the other way around. Because if it doesn't happen that way, then we get the glory, the project gets the glory, and he doesn't get the glory, and he's a jealous God. Amen? Amen? Not every addict has got a family who cares for them or loves them. Not every addict has got a family that they care about or they'll want to talk about. But you know what? Every addict has people, individuals, groups of people who they've affected, they've hurt in their passage through their addiction. And it's those people I want to talk about this afternoon. And the other thing I want to say about family is this: the family either supports recovery or it sabotages recovery. And for many of us who are working in the field of working with those who have addictions, we maybe need to rethink what we do about families. And I'll, at the risk of repeating myself later on, AA thought they'd got it sorted when somebody recovered and went home. They then discovered that the family then became the problem. In my experience in residential rehabilitation some years ago, we had numbers of those who came through our house, successfully became Christians, moved on, but struggled when they got home to their family. And the things that they found in their families. God cares about families. A father to the fatherless, a defender of widows is God in his holy dwelling. God sets the lonely in families, he leads out the prisoners with singing. What a God. Ephesians chapter 3, Paul says this: for this reason I kneel before the Father, from whom every family on heaven and in earth derives its name. And we're part of that family, all of us. We're part of God's family, the creator of the universe's family. Not any old family, but that family. That is something to get excited about. Are you getting excited? I'm not a bit worried. The sandwiches are weighing a bit heavy on me. I go to watch rugby on a Saturday quite regularly at Gloucester. We don't win very often. But I tell you what, when we win, the crowd goes delirious. I don't often see church crowds getting too delirious these days about Jesus, you know, but he's one who's worth getting delirious and excited about. Amen? I'll whip you up one way or another. Okay, so what's the problem? What's it look like? At the very least, 1.5 million adults are affected by a relative's drug use. So said Community Care magazine in 2016. The cost of eating disorders, a report in 2015, estimates that more than 725,000 people, I would say that if that was the right figure, it's over 850,000 this year, are affected by eating disorders. 11% of are males. Is that 725,000 families? Turning Point in 2006 said that parental alcohol misuse damages and disrupts lives of children and families in all areas of society, spanning all social classes. It blights the lives of families and harms the development of children trapped by the effect of their parents' problematic drinking, or whatever the addiction happens to be as far as I'm concerned. The figures for self-harm for adolescents range from 10 to 14% in 2009. There are around 3.8 secondary-aged children in the UK. So does that mean that there are somewhere between 380,000 and 450,000 affected directly by self-harm? How many families? Eating disorders can have a devastating effect on a family. There are 1.6 million people suffering from eating disorders. How many families? Terence Gorski, an American counsellor who I have great respect for, said this: recovery is not just about the addict. It's about everyone who is affected by the addiction. Recovery is not just about the addict. It's about everyone who is affected by the addiction. It took a long time to find this quote. I found it a few years ago, but it took me a long time to find it, because I've heard this figure bandied about all over the place. For every alcohol problem user, 5 other people are adversely affected. I've had it quoted as for every addict, 5 other people. Where was it? I found it. Paolino and Macready, 1977. There are 6 million people addicted to something in this country. Does that mean there are 30 million people in this country affected in families? There are 64 million people in the British Isles. How many people are affected by others' addictions? And what are we doing about it? If a child grows up with an addiction, other issues will come. Adverse childhood experiences tend to cluster. The home environment seems to be like a magnet to draw them in. And children start to experience emotional, physical or sexual abuse. And even back in 2006, they were finding that those figures were clustering again. The problem widens. We know that addiction is a family problem, that stresses the family to breaking point, and families don't know how to handle this. Let me just give you one example. I was invited to a family meeting of a local Jamaican family in Gloucester. Over half the family are Christians, attending a couple of local churches. They were concerned about a young brother who was drug using. This was the first time that the whole family had met together and talked together, I think, for years. But they were so desperate that they wanted to talk this issue through. And as I went round the room asking them about their involvement with this particular younger brother, I discovered that each member of the family in a different way had been affected by his addiction. Every member of the family at some stage had given him some money, but not told any of the others. Every member of the family, because they didn't want any shame, had found some way to get this young man out of trouble. In different ways, they had enabled him. In different ways, they'd kept him on addiction's path. And you know how the whole thing came to a head? He was living with an uncle. The uncle, a very upstanding member of the community, been on the local council, went back to Jamaica for a 6-week holiday. When he got back, he discovered that his nephew had sold the house. He'd forged his signature, he'd done all the necessary paperwork. This young man had an incredible IQ, and with the use of a computer, his uncle's computer, with the use of all the paperwork that his uncle left strewn around the house, he had actually sold the house. Fortunately, the final sale hadn't gone through, but this brought the family to its senses. Now, that was a financial issue for that family. It was an emotional issue for that family, and it was a shame issue for that family. And the figures involved were enormous. But we'll see more things. What happens when there is a child in the family who has an addiction problem? Families can actually go to pieces, because they just can't handle the situation. Parents fall out with each other. Jenny and I, my wife, we have sat on numerous occasions with a mum and a dad who are talking about their child and how they handle the addiction situation. And it's like this, it's like World War III. You've got parents threatening to separate, to leave each other, even Christian parents, because they can't agree on what to do about their child who is struggling with their addiction. Other siblings can get blamed for being a bad example. The addict gets far too much attention, so everybody else in the family gets neglected. Other siblings resent the presence. A young man sat next to me 2 years ago. He sat next to me only a couple of weeks ago in the rugby, of a family who I know very, very well. He sat next to me 2 years ago and he said, "Pat, if my brother doesn't leave home, I'm leaving home. I am so fed up to the back teeth of what's going on in our family and all the horrors of the arguments and the rows and the stuff that's going on." The addict blames everyone, especially the parents, for their problems. Now, many of you know these things. You know this stuff because you've worked with addicts for such a long time. I hope you don't mind me reminding you. Rows and bad language and fights just break up the peace. What happens if the husband is the addict? I share your problem. When I think of some of the people that I've been involved with over the years, and some of the heartache, when a husband walks out of the family, when a wife walks out of the family, and what happens? They just do not come back. They do not come back. And all the anger and all the frustration and all the grief that goes on. The wife can separate from her husband, the parents can tell the child to leave, or the addict simply quits the family. And then the family reorganises without the addict, and he goes into treatment, or she goes into treatment, or the child goes into treatment, and then they come back to this reorganised family that's reorganised without them, and they discover it's a different family from the one that they left. And the family can either sabotage or can actually facilitate that recovery. And what's the response of the family? Social isolation starts. Conflict increases. Wife tries to control the husband. Parents try to control the child. But both usually fail. And the family gives up attempts to control the addict. And the wife begins to worry about her own sanity, and the children adopt roles so they can cope. Some of you may be the children of alcoholics or drug addicts or some other addiction. In my experience, one of the difficulties is that the ways that you coped, your coping mechanisms that you set up to protect yourself from what went on in your family, if they've not been dealt with, you've carried them on into later life. And they've become a problem to you. The family just adjusts to the way things are happening. They do the wrong things for the right reasons. I was in Scotland a couple of weeks ago, crumbs, times fly when you're my age. August, I was in Scotland, had a phone call. I was having supper. Somebody said, "Can I just talk to you about my brother? We've discovered he's got a gambling problem." I said, "Oh, how have you discovered he's got a gambling problem? What's happened?" "Well, my other brother has refused to lend him any more money." And I said, "Is that really serious?" "Well, we've now discovered that his wife didn't know about this gambling problem. It's been going on for 20 years, but that my older brother has actually bought his house, i.e. paid off the mortgage, so that he and his wife could still live in it, because he had nearly £250,000 worth of gambling debts." And this has thrown this whole family into an absolute turmoil, which nobody really wants to talk about. Doing the wrong things for the right reasons. It seemed quite reasonable to buy him out of his house. The silent fears, coping with the unpredictable nature of addiction. Those of you who've been addicted to drugs and alcohol, those of you who've been addicted to anything, we all know how unpredictable addiction can be. And that final statement, "What can I do for you so you don't have to use drugs or cut yourself again?" The cry of many a parent. The family has become codependent and is struggling with the addiction. Joseph Rowntree Trust said this: there was a mix of, in a report they produced in 2005, their summary of what happened in families was this: there was a mix of anger, sadness, anxiety, shame, social isolation and loss as parents, brothers and sisters struggled to adapt to the impact of drugs in all their lives. This was greatly compounded by a sense of being totally impotent. Hopeless and possibly helpless. Referred to this week on BBC One, Lisa. Married, has 5 children. She said, in front of the camera, "I put heroin before my children." Because for those of us who are addicted, the addiction is number one. It's the first thing in our lives. It's the main thing. It's the thing we're interested in. That, I think, is still available. Look at it. Listen to it. Read it. So how does the family feel about self-harm? Well, it says that after the discovery, this is a report that the BMJ brought out in 2016. That's as far as it got. This report didn't go anywhere else except the British Medical Journal, as far as I'm aware. And yet it's absolute dynamite. Who said after the discovery of self-harm, parents described the initial feelings of shock, anger and disbelief. Later reactions included stress, anxiety and guilt. The onset or worsening of clinical depression. Social isolation was reported as parents withdrew from social contact due to the perceived stigma. Reported siblings significantly harmed, ranging from upset and stress to feelings of responsibility and worries again about stigma at school. 2016. I was talking to a family down in the West Country. Mum and Dad had discovered that their child was using drugs and was also self-harming. They made contact with the church. And the leader of the church said, "What I suggest you do is join yourself to a home group, a life group. They will help support you. They'll encourage you." The first life group they went to, they were asked to tell their story. They told their story. And the group offered to pray for them. And somebody prayed, "Dear Lord, help this couple to be better parents in the future." That brought their spiritual journey to a rather juddering stop for a little while. So how do families feel and react? We do get on some positive stuff. I got what? Who's watching the time? I'm not. Never mind. Okay. They feel powerless. They feel helpless. They feel anger. They feel what is real. My friend, I'll call him John. His wife self-harms and has an eating disorder, and they have a small child. He has a highly responsible job. He works in a business where nobody, including the managing director, is allowed to have a phone at work during the day, except John, because of the unpredictable nature of her self-harm. She generally burns herself with the iron, with curling tongs, with anything that she can find. Stoke up the heating on the central heating and lean on a radiator. That will do. Anywhere, anything, she will self-harm. Praise God, she's starting to come through. Jenny and I are providing a little bit of support there. But I talked to John, and John just says, "I just do not know what to do. I do not know which way to turn. What is real in my life these days? Where have all my feelings gone?" Parents feel a loss of self-confidence and the ability to make decisions. They're in a grief process. The person's with them, but it hasn't left home. They're in denial, and the family survives on 3 don'ts. And this is why, you know what, addiction is hidden, the elephant in the room. But family addiction is hidden, because most families survive on don't talk about it, don't trust anyone, and don't have any feelings. And if I can stop him using one more time, he will most definitely see sense. As I said earlier, AA thought they'd got it sorted, but they haven't. The stress of trying to solve the loved one's addiction alone. The stress of the confusion and often panic when a loved one is discovered to have an addiction problem. That's enough. And the stress of family conflict and the stress of the loved one's addiction taking centre stage over everything else. If you've been addicted, you know your addiction was centre stage. But it's also centre stage in the family. It's the one thing the family revolves around its whole life. And a few other stress things, which I've hinted at already. I want to move on. So let's turn it around. What sort of hope is there? Well, recovery for these families is possible. Praise God, it is possible. But the majority of help that is currently available is not statutory. It's voluntary. It's Al-Anon. It's AdFam. It's DrugFam. And other such voluntary organisations. As far as I'm aware, there isn't a single Christian organisation working with families directly at this moment in time. There are some rehabilitation centres who have an outreach worker that tries to contact families. And that would be great. But I'm suggesting that there is also a situation where churches could set up and projects could set up support groups for families. And this is something that Living Recovery, which is part of Isaac, has been seeking to develop. I was invited to talk about drugs and the church at I'll call it a denominational conference of young leaders. There were 300 present at this conference. It was only a few years ago. And I talked about the effects of drugs and alcohol on the family. And at the end of my little talk, I just said, if anyone would like me to pray about that because they've been affected by this issue, come and see me afterwards. Jenny and I found ourselves praying for 14 people at the end of that service. Now you may say, it doesn't sound very many. 14 out of 300 young leaders of a denomination. But for me, it was an eye-opener, because all of these people thought they were totally alone. All of these people thought that nobody would be interested. All of these people felt it was a bit of a shame thing to mention that they'd had a dad who was a drunkard, or they had a mum who used drugs, or whatever. They never thought. Nobody in church ever preached from the pulpit, by the way, there's no shame in being brought up in a family where there's an addiction. One of the biggest challenges to recovery in the family is the fact, of course, that the family generally believes that if the addict recovers, everything will be okay. But actually the family needs help as well. And the family has to be just as responsible for their own recovery. So the Living Recovery Support Groups, very briefly, because I'd like to take an opportunity for some questions. What we're trying to do is to help families to recognise that they're not alone, because most of them feel that they're alone. We're trying to help them recognise the issue of broken boundaries and the need to repair them. We're trying to help them to be themselves in a safe environment and express their troubled emotions. We run a pilot recently, and it was amazing to hear how the families were just suddenly opened up like flowers. There was silence for nearly 20 minutes. And then when the families realised that everybody was in the same position, they started to talk. They started to share experiences. They started to encourage and support one another. And overcome the denial that has kept them from expressing their feelings. And some of those feelings have been buried for years. To learn good communication skills. Because addiction destroys family communication. By the way, we live in families today, don't we, where communication is not always good. So much of it is electronic, and not much of it verbal sometimes. Detachment and responsibility for self. Learn to detach, love and refocus on assuming responsibility for their own behaviour. And learn about the addictions, because most of the families don't even understand the addiction problem. Help them abandon old ineffective ways. Help them understand how denial, blaming, rescuing and minimising to just make the problem worse. And learn how to engage in positive family activities. Help them to prepare for relapse, should it happen. And understand and break free from codependency. None of us suffer from codependency, of course. If we work in this field, we're always in danger of suffering from codependency. One definition that I've had of codependency is you're dying and somebody else's life flashes before your eyes. I'm not sure whether that's right. But there are 6 C's of codependency. Here they are. I didn't cause it, I can't control it, I cannot cure it, I can take care of myself, I can communicate feelings, and I can make healthy choices. So if ever you think you're getting into that field, and of course none of us do, working with people with addictions, take note. The role of the support group in family recovery is learning strategies to support the loved one into and through recovery. Knowing that they can only help someone who wants help. And all the time, all this takes time, it takes patience, and it takes prayer. Leave you with the introduction to the course. And it's a 4-day course, and it can either be run as 4 consecutive days, parents, other relatives and friends. Addiction is a family problem that stresses the family to breaking point, impacts the stability of the family home, the family unit, mental, physical and financial health, changes the family dynamics. What are we up against? How can we help? Can the family play a part in recovery? God undoubtedly cares about families. How do we mirror that care? Thank you for listening. Any questions? What have you got? Really what you're talking about is a basic understanding of the process of addiction and why people become addicted. And that is really a teaching subject. So for example, on this particular course for families, we actually spend some time in talking to them about the effects of the addiction on their loved one. What kind of things? We ask them what they will have observed, and then we explain it in terms of how things are happening, either in the mind, the brain, or whatever is going on. But it's not simply a couple of sentences. It's an ongoing process. So, for example, again, working with that, when we were working with in a residential setting, we used to talk to our clients and say to them, what's the situation with your family? Do they know about your addiction? We would ask them how much the family know about their addiction, and we would actually try and explain to them their family probably doesn't understand where they're coming from. So part of the process, I don't know whether they do this at Yeldall, but part of our process was actually allowing the guys to go home at weekends to start testing the water. And we would actually telephone the family and say, if you want some information, we're prepared to give it. Sometimes we had the phone slammed down on us, which wasn't helpful. But sometimes people would say, yeah, we'd like some information. We'd either send them something in writing. If they lived near, we'd send somebody to visit and chat to them about the situation. But it's a big subject, because you're basically talking about educating the family to understand where their loved one is coming from when they've already got preconceived ideas about what the problem's all about. They've either taken guilt to themselves or pointing the finger straight at the addict and saying it's all his fault, her fault, or whatever. So it's unravelling all that stuff. So it's quite a big job. Can I say that that's partly my experience as well? But just because people don't accept the message, it doesn't mean you don't keep giving it. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is this. I've had at least 3 examples, including one of a doctor who refused the tough love message and went out and got his son's heroin for him on a Christmas Eve when he was due to come into our rehab centre on New Year's Day, and he died of an overdose on Christmas Day. Okay? So when you hear that, and when you speak to that family, and they say, we wish that we had actually not done that. We wish, but we can't turn the clock back. But tough love is hard, and it's all about boundaries. But it's the broken boundaries that often have been the problem, particularly with children who come into addiction, because there's been no consistency in the family. So it's talking about those issues. Just keep on talking, Pete. Okay, as a former pastor of a church, as well as working in this field, I believe that there is... Dave Partington was talking about this whole business of humility and how we actually address ourselves to the situations we find in our churches and in our communities. And I really do think that the issue of addictions and families is such a big issue that it's something that every church should have in some way, some access to talking about it. Because if they don't, families will feel that it's a taboo subject, because it is often a taboo subject. It's a shame issue, and shame issues are not the sort of subjects that people talk about. I can think of issues when I was leading a church in the Midlands that people didn't want to talk about publicly because they weren't given permission publicly to talk about it. And we have situations in our churches where we can talk about spiritual gifts, we can talk about worship, we can talk about all kinds of spiritual subjects, we can talk about working with the poor, but when we start talking about things that are close to home, like those who have suffered abortion, those who have had problems with addictions, when we start talking about the fact that probably 25% of all men in our churches are addicted to pornography, then those kind of issues start causing some hackles to be raised in some quarters, but I think we have to be brave and do it. And if we do suspect that there are a number of people in our churches that are affected by drugs and alcohol, either through it or any addiction, either on the receiving end or actually addicted themselves, then we need somebody to come in who is experienced to talk about that issue. And there's enough of you here who could go into churches and talk about that issue and actually say to the church, this is what's going on in the world, don't close your eyes to it. As a church in Gloucester, yesterday we fed 72 people. 72 people, of whom something like 25% are homeless, 50% are addicted to something, and the rest are lonely and lost souls in the city of Gloucester. We are actively looking for ways in which we can help every one of those 72 people. But we're going to need help to do that. It's not something I can do and other people can do on our own. And I think churches need, again, to be able to invite people in. It sometimes isn't. It's almost frowned upon. Oh, they're not our denomination, or they're not our group, or oh crumbs, they might mention the Holy Spirit, or whatever it happens to be. Sorry, I've got my soapbox a bit, Roger. That's what I think. I think the issue's got to be brought up. It has to be out in the open. We have a new mother and toddler group at our church, and already we're finding that these mums are all starting to ask for prayer for things, because we make it obvious that as a Christian mother and toddler group, we will pray for people, and all sorts of stuff is starting to come out the woodwork. And I think that maybe our church is different from most. We've got quite a few recovered addicts. We've got a number of people from addicted families coming. So for me, that's what we do. We talk about it and we raise the issue in a very straightforward way. Thanks.
Thank you, Pat.